Hello and welcome to Meet the Music. I'm your host, Thomas Corley. Thank you for joining us on our musical journey. We are here deep into our new series, The Uniqueness of the Many Sounds of the African American Music Genres. This episode's genre is funk. Join me for insight is Dr. Anthony Tony Bolden. Dr. Bolden is Associate Professor of African American Studies and the Director of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Kansas. Dr. Bolden research areas and teaching interests include a broad spectrum of topics related to artistic expressions in the African diaspora, especially Black music and literature. He is the author of Afro Blue, Improvisations in African American Poetry and Culture, and Groove Theory, the blues foundation of funk, which I think may be the source of our conversation today. You can visit his website at funkactivity.org. That funk is spelled with PH, where they address questions in the culture and historical explanations of funk. I have no idea where Dr. Bolden is going to take us in our conversation, but I do know he's going to drop you and me off into some funk. And you need to be in the sponge mode and ready to soak it all in. Dr. Tony Bolden, welcome to Meet the Music.
Well, thank you, Brother Thomas, and I really thank you for reaching out and for having me on your program.
All right. So let's just dive right in. How did funk music get into your headspace? I mean, why not jazz? Why not rock? Or even Zydeco? I mean, how did that get in your headspace?
Well, for me, it's actually sort of it's very much related, to jazz. But maybe the best way to answer your question is that this was the music of my generation. So this is, I was a party person. I had a very different life from, the academy.
Academics, huh?
Yeah. So I was a party dude, for real, and in the old days, we had house parties. Young people might not be able to believe that today, but we would go to parties and somebody would say, I'm having a party. And every once in a while, there were pay parties. Sometimes they were invitation only, but even those, there were exceptions. But generally, people would say, I'm having a party. Somebody would say, somebody have a party. And anybody could come to that party. We would go to, I grew up in the San Francisco, Oakland Bay Area.
Oh, okay. Right?
So we would go to parties throughout the Bay Area. That meant Oakland, which was predominantly Black, 70% Black, or over. Richmond was 70% Black or over. There were large sections of, large Black communities in Berkeley, where I was raised for the most part, although I lived in Oakland shortly too. So Berkeley had great parties. And El Cerrito, there were Black people who lived in El Cerrito, which is a small city, and also San Francisco, so you could go to anybody's party and people would dance and have fun. Youngsters would be outside talking, sometimes leaning on the cars, and nobody ever complained. Mm-hmm. There was never any, I never heard one argument. We were just there to have fun.
Sure.
So that was the music that people played, right? And then later on, I moved to New Orleans to go to college, and fell in love with the city. And when the house parties played out, I shifted to the clubs. And I stayed in the club so long. This is a true story. I stayed in the club so long that I saw the dances come back.
Right.
I saw the dances that I had seen and danced as, 16, 17, 15-year-old. And they would come back in slightly different forms. I'll talk about that in another a completely different book later on. But yeah, so that's my relationship, in one sense, but in the conceptual sense, and one of the reasons that got me curious about what became groove theory is that I'm a veteran. So I was, my mother kicked me out of the house when I was 18 years old. Man.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the Army and spent
I'm a
time
Navy
over.
veteran.
All right. So kindred spirits.
Right, exactly.
So when I got out of the Army, or actually when I was I was stationed in South Korea. And that's where, being away from home, you can, relate to this. So you're young and you see things, you start asking questions, it gives you a different sense of the world. So that's where I became really interested in jazz. My father was a jazz buff, but I had never really, appreciated it. But I got interested in ideas. It was where I was. There was a lot of race stuff going on. Very very in your face. All the stuff that people are actually talking about now and experiencing now. We had to deal with that as youngsters overseas, and we had fights, like literal fights, fist
Wow.
fights.
Wow.
So I, as a kid, I'm trying to figure. I'm 19 years old. You're trying to figure what's going on with this, and so that's when I became interested in ideas, and the music became interesting to me. But I couldn't find a lot of recordings. So when I got out of the Army, I sought out my father, and so he sat me down and began to teach me basically the history of jazz. And when we got to the early 50s, he told me a story about one of these musicians. His name is Horace Silver. And he said, and this is actually in the book, and he said, well, after this 40s period, some of these younger musicians, they grew up playing bebop, but they changed that up a little bit. And so Horace Silver was a bebopper, but he played funky. And I knew my father wasn't talking about James Brown, right? I knew he didn't mean funky in that way, but it was, and so years later, I didn't think about it at the time. I was only 21, so I didn't think about it at the time. But later on, many years later, I began to ask myself, how did he know? Because my father didn't raise me. That's just another story. But
right.
we were around each other. I knew him and everything. But he had never used that word before. So I was, how did he know that I knew what that meant? He used that word to explain something. If you use a word to somebody, you say, well, this means this is what this, that means that you figure this person's going to know. It's like he's translating something to me.
Right.
How did he know that I knew? That was the question. And so that suggested to me clearly that there was something in Black culture about that word that wasn't just, like funk music of the 70s. And I became curious about the concept. How did that concept become important, to Black people, and how did this concept come about? And then how did the musicians, make the transition or interpret ultimately this concept into music that we now know as funk?
Okay. So let me back up for a second. So the music that was a part of your childhood and then into your teenage years, Um, was it someone in your household who brought in the music, or was this something that was common for you to hear on the street through the radio?
Oh yeah, well, all of the above. So, I grew up in a musical culture, even though most people, nobody I knew played music. Oh,
Hmm.
maybe one or two people, but music was all around me. Everybody listened to the rhythm and blues station, which was KDIA Lucky 13, which is a black radio station in Oakland. Sly Stone actually worked for that station for a
Oh
while.
wow.
Yeah. So, but that was the blacks that he did a whole lot of other stuff, but that was like the black station um, that all of us youngsters and then and other people of slightly older did also. But so my mother was someone who loved blues. So, she would actually play the blues a lot. She also listened to, Sam Cooke and Nancy Wilson, a lot of other people.
Mm.
Um, but when she had her, company, she had, her friends over. Once evening hit, she put on BB King. So I grew up listening to this, right? But you could walk down the street in the Bay Area. Nobody had air conditioning.
Right.
Basically say so. People would have their windows open, so you would hear songs just walking up the street. So it was really sort of growing up. The music was like I've written another essay. It's like breathing air. Like we didn't hear a lot of the quote unquote serious jazz. So you didn't hear a lot of bebop. You didn't hear a lot of, Charlie Parker, Dizzy
Hmm.
Gillespie, and Miles Davis, and people like that. But you did hear a lot of soul jazz, um, musicians that would play, versions of James Brown. But it was impossible to grow up in that neighborhood and actually in all of the neighborhoods that I lived in without knowing these musicians. It was nobody ever said you should know. I mean, you would go if you went everywhere we went. Like almost everything we did involved some music one way or another. If you went somewhere, like if you went to a recreation center, if you went to the park, there was a park a couple of blocks away from me. Um, you people would be playing the radio, or if they were inside, they'd be playing records.
Hmm.
It was people would be singing.
Oh
You
wow.
know, yeah. So, it was something that everybody did. And then, of course, dancing was very important too.
Yeah, I guess you and I had kind of the same teenage and college experience when it came to the party scene, because I do remember music as a kid, playing basketball in the background. You know,
Hmm.
so yeah,
Hmm.
we have that same relationship. And then I remember, house parties, backyard
Hmm.
parties, and
Yep.
parties that turned into somebody renting a hall out because of back the houses were getting too small.
Yep.
And then yeah, so I can relate to that. That's kind of where I got my feet wet. But
Hmm.
and then my taste got spread out by just being having these many friends because I was the only child, and my mother
Hmm.
got remarried, and I ended up with five sisters. But in the process, I connected with all these fellas, and each one of these
Hmm.
fellas had a different genre of music they were listening to. So I was kind of stretched. So I didn't get
Hmm.
the in depth or initiation into funk like most people.
Hmm.
So, so what's the history of it? I mean, I understand that you have, maybe Ohio is considered the possibly the birthplace of it when you've got so many bands coming out of there. But what do you say? I guess you have to say commercially. When did funk, get its birth?
Well, give you if we're talking about funk music as such. That's the Godfather of soul. That's
Yeah.
James Brown.
Right.
So, he's the one who creates what became known as the one, meaning the rhythm of the one, the first rhythm, first beat in a four four beat measure, right?
Yeah.
So and what was two things that are important. First, the fact that he came up with this concept, which is what it is in terms of a rhythmic concept
Mm-hmm.
of music, as a dancer. He
Mm-hmm.
really wasn't a musician, in the sense of, you listen to his other, I won't get into, what they say about him, but he was a dancer.
Mm-hmm.
He led his band as a dancer. And there are stories about, um, him communicating with his instrumentalists, his actual, the musicians who played in his band, and they would say that he would make certain sounds, or and then they would try to translate that by playing. Is this what you mean? And he'd say yes or no, or yeah, more like this. And so so he wasn't a musician. So that's important because funk is directly related to dance. But the other thing that's really important is that the concept itself, the word and the concept itself, has a really long history, and there were a lot of stigmas attached to it. So basically, one way of thinking, I'm going to oversimplify this for your listeners, but basically, there was a time when Black people didn't call ourselves Black.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was a time when the word was Negro, or in some cases colored.
Mm-hmm. Right,
Colored,
right, right,
right?
right.
All right. So because there were certain stigmas attached to Blackness. And it wasn't until, and so funk is very much related to this. So it's not until those stigmas are questioned in a very broad sense. So you really, it's during the the mid to late 60s when people begin to use funk, and really sort of it replaces soul, because some people felt that that soul had kind of been quote unquote sold out,
Mm.
that had been commodified. Um, and so, in the old days, what would happen is that, Black people would then find something else, or in this case, a word that they felt could not be commodified, be, very difficult, to, appropriate that to white culture, because it was very, very closely related to Black culture for a lot
All
of
right.
different reasons.
All right.
And so it's but to go back to the 50s, you had what in retrospect was kind of like a funk music within jazz. So Horace Silver had recorded and released a song called Opus de Funk. Curtis Fuller, who just passed a few months ago, a trombone player, really important trombone player, recorded Blues de Funk. Ray Charles, the great Ray Charles, 1958, Blue Funk.
Mm-hmm.
Number of people had Blue Funk. Cannonball Adderley um, released a song called Blue Funk, and so did Heavy D, many years later. So the musicians, this has always been something among the musicians, but when you get to the late 60s, they're questioning, the youth culture is questioning certain stereotypes about Black culture.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so the things that were related to funk, which were essentially African derived, things that were related to, African legacies, if you go all the way back. So the way we, worship, our notions of spirituality, the way we worship God, the
Mhm.
body language, dancing, all of those things that had been, sort of criticized, just on the basis of it, just because, right? They began to reassess those things, and so this is when funk music really emerges, and you have someone like the young Sly Stone. I mentioned James Brown before. Sly Stone was equally important because while Brown created, the sort of, the actual rhythmic component, which was obviously essential, Sly Stone was the one who really came up with the attitude and the sort of contrarian attitude, the bohemian aspect of it.
Mm.
Uh, and he's the one who actually began to proselytize the word in live performance. It was before that it was a bad word. You weren't supposed to say this word in public.
Yeah, that's the thing about our music or our lyrics. You can't stand on the street corner and say it.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, yeah. And you put it into a song or put it into music gives us the freedom. I guess that's
Yeah,
a
the
good
license.
word. Yeah, license. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Mm.
So that's it. But also, there's another component of that that's really important. The dancers. The dancers were the ones who promoted this phrase. So there was a dance. So a lot of people, if your listeners go to Google, or they look up the song "Funky Broadway," um, what they'll find is that comes out in 1967. Not Wilson Pickett. It's Dyke and the Blazers who did it first. But that was based on a dance that he saw in 1960. It was recorded in 66.
Mm.
And the song is based on a dance that he observed. So the dance preceded the song. Then a couple of years later, you have the Funky Four Corners in 1968, and later on, I think in 70, um, there's the Funky Chicken.
Yeah.
Right. So it was a word. So it was really the dancers who played a major role, that and the people who create our dances tend not to be celebrated. They don't, it's not like when you write a song, you write a book, or you record a song or what have you, your name is documented.
Hmm.
But a lot of times the people who are really making important contributions are the dancers, and there's no artifact for them. So I want to make sure that people understand the contributions of the dancers.
Yeah, that'd be a good subject to write about. I guess we go through the phases of spirituality. Blues, jazz, bebop, and then you get to the point where you're talking soul or R&B, Motown sound, and now we are on the other side of the protest music and kind of getting into like a freedom era of music. So
Yes.
I guess my question is, was it necessary to have these, not necessary, but was it a transition to have large bands to do this funk thing? I mean, can you have funk without a large band like the Funkadelics or Ohio Players or Slave? I mean, these are all big bands. Is funk not?
I think it depends. You're touching on something, because that's part of what the attack or the decisions in the music industry to basically de-emphasize bands is was really pivotal in the history of funk. One of the interesting things, to your point, the great bass player Bootsy Collins. For those of you who may not know, Bootsy Collins played with James Brown as a teenager. He was
Mm-hmm.
recruited, he and his band members, and then they later play um, with Parliament Funkadelic. The point that I'm trying to make that's really, that's significant is that Bootsy Collins said that musicians um, said, well, why can't the musicians themselves, why can't the band, be the band rather than just have, these singers be out front? Let's put the band out front. All they could sing themselves. So this kind of collectivity that you're talking about was extremely important. To funk, regardless of whether we're talking about, Ohio or wherever. There was a kind of a sense of being a collective. Actually,
Mm-hmm.
Parliament Funkadelic is a collective.
All
If
right.
you, the Ohio players saw themselves as, pretty much a collective. War. A lot of times, if you go to the songwriting credits, not so much in P Funk, but in a number of these bands, the band itself is actually listed as the songwriter. And I guess that probably created a few issues sometime later. But I think it's more difficult. The funk that we understand. I suppose it would be interesting to see, I guess. Let me think about that. I think um, music is done digitally today.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so a lot of hip hop artists actually, identify with funk or, use these related aspects of it. So I suppose you could, not in the way that those bands did, but maybe in a different way. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying because now, I mean, every genre of music kind of has this fusion in some kind of fashion, and like you mentioned, how we've got from I don't know bebop to the hard bop, and then we got to Miles doing his thing, and then Herbie Hancock doing his thing. You know, that got frowned on upon, in from traditionalists if
Right.
you're talking about jazz, and
Mm-hmm.
so now the funk that we grew up with is so heavily utilized in rap or hip hop that you got um, Pulitzer, Pulitzer Prize winning artist Kendrick Lamar, dropping
Mm-hmm.
stuff that's got the funky, jazzy sound to it. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, but yeah, so what is your take on the funk community around the world? I mean, because you got funk metal, you got Latin funk, you got jazz funk, you've got Russian. I mean, you got Russia playing funk now. I mean, and have any of your books been translated into a different language?
Oh no, not that I know of. It just came. It just came out in November.
Remember?
My sense is I don't know that a scholar um, you know they want to read what I have to say and translate. You know I don't. Here's the thing. I guess one of the questions that you're raising, and one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book is, it goes back to the question how did this develop? Because because I'm not a musician, I can't play at all, and I'm
Nor
not.
can I.
Yeah, so. But so to talk, so my real focus is really kind of like more philosophical. Is basically, the history of the idea itself, and the idea, there are a lot of aspects to the actual meaning of the word and the concept, and all of that. And this is something that Black people created, right? Even in my own experience, working on the book itself, when I started out, people actually told me, I'll give you an example. The very first, I organized probably the first funk conference in the academy, certainly one of the first, in 2007. I was at the University of Alabama, and this is no lie, I got negative emails about that conference. Now, none of them were threatening or anything like that, but they were all upset about it, and they said it was Looney Tunes. That was one, that kind of thing.
Wow.
But and then I also had a Black friend who was a professor at the time, who basically thought that this was ridiculous. So even within the time that I worked on it, I've seen certain kinds of trends. And one of the trends has been to talk about the concept in ways that de-emphasize what the word means to Black people in Black culture, right?
Wow.
So you got, like you were talking about, all these different, variations of it, right? There's funk in Brazil. There's all these different. Okay, and I'm not here. I'm here to say, hey, all that's all well and good, but let's also talk about the people who created that idea, because they, especially since they were stigmatized, that comes from the people who, because a lot of this comes from the people who, the churches, the holiness churches, who were stigmatized as holy rollers in the old days.
All right.
Right? But a lot of the musicians come out of the charismatic Baptist churches and the Pentecostal churches, what used to be called sanctified churches, right? And so let's make sure that when we're talking about, because things happen when people interpret things, and when people interpret things, they tend to interpret them according to the way that, in terms of what it means to them. And that's all well and good. But what did it mean to Bessie Smith? When Bessie Smith said the funk is flying. See, that's what I'm interested in.
Right.
We can talk about that other stuff. Yeah. So, I forgot about the original question you raised.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it.
But,
You giving me some narrative here to listen to, because I think that's a very key point. I mean, the phrase of the word funk or whatever is not just something that just dropped on us in the 60s and 70s. It's been around and it's been utilized, and people are, like you said, trying to, I don't want to say whitewash it, but they're trying to, like you said, de-emphasize it. And our conversation here today is that we want to bring attention to it, and that we want to make sure that, one, the world knows that it, like all things, started off in the African American community, and we want to make sure people know that. And so I appreciate you just even though we kind of took a sidestep, I appreciate you doing that, because it makes a difference in the conversation.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, what was the spark for that writing? I mean, was it because of the desensitizing or decentralization of the word, or what was the spark for you to write?
No, I didn't find out all of that until later. So, the first book is about, so my real training as an academic is in literature.
Okay.
And so before that, before I became an academic, I was active as an artist. So I saw, and we had our own writers workshop that was connected to a theater group. So and these were all Black people,
Mm-hmm.
and no connection with any kind of university or anything of that sort. And so there was a very clear relationship between, not necessarily with everybody, but when they wrote, in terms of their style. But again, music was central to the way that we talked about things. Sometimes, we'd even go to this blues club. This is in New Orleans. It's a historic blues club that we'd go to after, our meetings. And I was the baby of the group, actually, the youngest person. So I'm soaking everything in. When I got to graduate school, there was the emphasis of that kind of thing. And so, so when I wrote my dissertation, I became curious. I wanted to basically, put into this academic language, what these people who had influenced me, so these concepts, and I studied Black poetry that was related to music. That became Afro Blue. But at the end of that book, um, I began to ask questions myself. So, I had clearly demonstrated that there were these connections,
Mm-hmm.
but I was arguing that the writers were, so basically saying or doing with literature and poetry in various ways, but they were doing something that was sort of similar to what the musicians were doing, that they were kind of influenced by the musicians. So if that's true, then how do I explain the music? That was the question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless you just say all Black people got rhythm, right? just so no, philosophically, how do you,
Yeah.
like, what are some of the ideas? And that's how I, became interested in funk. I never did answer that question, per se, but clearly funk is a concept that was central to um, music making in Black culture, particularly in the blues, era, that they're the ones who really create this concept that we understand now as the funk, right? But it really gets sort of fashioned, in blues during the blues era, right? So, but
Okay.
that's really what does it. It's really the follow up to this earlier book that raised a question that I could not answer previously.
So by chance, were you able to, for an introduction to our listeners, were you able to come up with a list of recommendations for somebody who, say, for instance, you're at a dinner party, instead of talking about the weather, the person says, "What's on your playlist?"
Oh, well, yeah, I got a whole. In fact, I if they go to the if they go to University Press of Mississippi, where the book that which is the book is was published by University Press of Mississippi, there's actually a playlist listed there. But briefly, just off the top of my head, you've got to go to, Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. That was, James Brown's. That's where he really figures out. One way to think about it, funk is what's in the bag. It's
Right.
a bag of dance steps, right? That, um, you know, Sly Stone, Dance to the Music. Sly and the Family Stone, Dance to the Music. Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself. Uh, Shaka Khan, the whole list of Shaka Khan with Rufus,
Yeah.
Betty Davis. They Say I'm Different, Nasty Gal. People like that. And also, I include in the book Gil Scott Heron. But you mentioned, the Ohio Players, Pain, songs like that. Funky Worm, Fire, Love Roller Coaster, the music of Slave, so the whole.
Is that playlist that you have, is that contextual to the book?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. So you can, just about all of the songs that I mention or talk about, or people who are listed in the book, there's a song connected to. So yeah, so actually, it does a better job than me trying to come up with stuff off the top of my head.
Oh, no worries. I appreciate you again dropping a few names there. What do you have coming up in the future?
Well, for me,
any more writings or?
Yes, sir. Always, I'll be doing that. Well, I'm no longer here, so I'm like the musicians in that sense. So for me, this is really philosophy for the people. That's how I think of it. Normally, we think of philosophy as something that's far removed from us, and it's something that these people do in these other spaces. But I see the music as reflections of values and concepts and ideas and stuff like that. So I originally conceptualized this as a book about music and literature and other things. And I realized I was telling two different stories. So I'm actually working on a book now that examines the concept of funk in Black writing and to some degree visual art. But I'm doing a lot of different things. So
okay. What about any conferences coming up? Well, I mean, now that COVID's kind of behind us somewhat, do you have any conferences coming up or anything like that?
I have I haven't been contacted for any conferences, like academic conferences. There is a talk that will be virtual. There's a book festival in Florida that I'll be participating in. But if on my website I have listed a bunch of different video recordings that are connected to events that I've done with the book, and anything that is recorded that I have access to that I'll post there. So if they go to the website, that they'll or just continue to visit it, they'll have access to anything that I do.
Yeah, we'll have a link to that in our description from the podcast, and also a link to be able to purchase your book.
Oh, okay. Many thanks.
Yeah. We appreciate you coming on and helping us out, figure this whole funk thing out, and giving us a perspective of the philosophical piece of it instead of just a musical piece. So we appreciate that. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, can you drop your social media? Are you on social media? Drop your handles for that.
So you can follow me at Blue Funk 2020. The color blue 2020. That's on Twitter. I'm listed on Instagram, but I don't usually post. But I post a lot on Twitter, and also I'm the editor of the Langston Hughes Review. So Langston Review or at Langston Review. So at Blue Funk 2020 and at Langston Review on Twitter, and you can follow me there.
All right, appreciate it. All right, Dr. Bolden, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Corley. I really appreciate your invitation, and it's been a great conversation.
Thank you, sir. I want to thank Dr. Tony Bolden for sharing his musical journey to funk and philosophical lessons. I hope you gain a new perspective on funk. I'm definitely going to revisit my youth and listen to some funk. Please be sure to check out Dr. Bolden's writings. Click on the link below in the description. As always, please share this episode and your favorite episode with someone who wants to expand their playlist. They can listen directly from our website, meetthemusic.buzzsprout.com, or wherever they get their podcasts. If this was your first episode, be sure to listen to our most downloaded episode on Zydeco with Michael Tesserand. Or start at the beginning of this series with Dr. Raylan Rabaka on rap and hip-hop culture. Thank you for joining us on our musical journey. Remember, this Monday, it's Meet the Music.